anniversary event. As Steve mentioned, I'm the director of the Speculative Fiction and Cultures of Science program here. We're very proud of this program. It's very interdisciplinary, so as well as drawing on people in film studies and literary studies, sort of more traditional ways we might think about studying science fiction. We're also working with people from history, from sociology, from anthropology, from philosophy. I'm really thinking of ways that speculative fiction helps us illuminate some of the questions of sort of technological modernity. And the sort of greatest joy I have in doing this work and in being here at UCR is working with my students and seeing the really innovative research that they develop. So 3 of my students are here with me today. 2 of them recently graduated from the program. Brandy, who's in the middle, she is still in the early stages of figuring out her research program, but Brandy was also at UCR as an undergraduate, and she did research in the Eaton Collection as well as an undergraduate. So first I'm going to just pass the mic along and ask them each to speak a little bit about their research to you. Then we might have a follow-up question or so that I'll give to the panel based on their discussion, and then I'll leave some time at the end, so if any of you wanted to ask questions of the panelists, there'll be some time to do that. So first I'll pass it over to Taylor.
Thank you, Sherryl. Hello, I'm Taylor. I recently graduated. I recognize a few friendly faces here. I first came here in 2012. I was not part of the cluster hire that brought Sherryl and Nalo here, but their cluster hire was part of the reason I came. It was to support the Eaton Collection, I believe. And I just wanted to talk briefly about how I actually started using the collection. You would think if I came to UCR to study science fiction, of course I would be in the archive, but that wasn't it. I was in a graduate course on medieval romanticism and sovereignty, and Professor John Ganem knew that I did science fiction, and he was like, you shouldn't write about medieval sovereignty, you should go in the archive and write about these Edison Age stories. He knew what was in this archive, and he pushed me towards it because he knew my research. And while I was doing that, I found some really interesting images, which led to the publication of an article, which has images that I got from the Eaton Collection here. That article won an award recently. That's basically my whole career has been John Ganem, a medievalist professor who knew that this school had a strong support for science fiction and fantasy research. He was the one who pushed me to use the archive here. And so I think even more so for me than having the great faculty who directly support the mission of the Eaton Collection, it was really the fact that so many other professors and so many other staff members know that we have this great collection kind of led them to support my research more than even I was expecting them to. And so that's pretty much been my experience in the Eaton. I've spent many summers in here making extra money working on a documentary. I was sort of a research assistant on that. I got to find a lot of things that way. I was able to glance through a lot of early science fiction, especially the fanzines, which are unique to the Eaton Collection, which allowed me to build my research from all of that as well. So I'm very grateful for that. But it all started because of a medievalist who knew that we had this great collection. That's me, Taylor.
Go over the plant here. Hello, my name is Brandy Lewis, pronouns she, her, hers. I was an undergraduate here at UC Riverside, moving from East LA to Chino to Walnut and then finally here. And when I first started, one of the first courses I had taken was actually a sci-fi course on cyberpunk film with Sherryl. And so I had slowly started working into this world because growing up, my parents couldn't afford books as easily. And it wasn't until senior year where I started looking at the furry fandom and people who identify with animals and what does it mean to be human with animals. And one of the books that had recently come out was by Fred Patton, who had donated materials to the Eaton Collection. And so Sherryl started helping me get on the route of doing a book review, doing some research, and it really was the press I needed to decide not to go one direction, but to go for a PhD instead, which my faculty members had said, maybe you can do this work. Maybe there's interest inside of you to look at these texts. And I think the power that the collection, let alone speculative fiction, has is that it allows us to speculate on the possibilities of where we can go. And I think definitely this archive gives us that foundation of what's been done in the past and where can we go from here. And so for now, I plan to still work with the Eaton Collection, but also get more students interested within my own kind of cohort and as well the coming freshmen to see what they're into and how science fiction and the collection can play a part of that.
Hello, I'm Josh Pearson. When I got my master's degree in 2008, I realized I wanted to go on and study not just American literature, which I looked at in my master's degree, but science fiction in particular. And I asked my mentors, where should I go? What are some great faculty members I could work with? And one of the pieces of advice that I got was, don't just look for a single faculty member who could support your research. Try and find a campus that has a broader infrastructure. And that's one of the things that made UCR so attractive to me, is not only were they doing these cluster hires to build a science fiction program, but they also had supportive administrators, and they had the Eaton Collection, which was a physical manifestation of UCR's investment in science fiction as a discipline. And I knew that if I came, even though the reality of academia is that sometimes faculty can come and go, that UCR would be a home for science fiction research for me in my career no matter what. And while I've been here, that has absolutely been the case. And I have, like Taylor, spent many summers in the Eaton Collection, both forwarding my own research and also doing some on-the-side RA work for others, supporting the field in that way. But one of the things that I in particular have found useful about the Eaton Collection is a lot of times when people think about an archival collection, they think primarily about primary texts, about rare volumes and stories and novels. But one of the things that has been particularly valuable for me is the wide breadth of material that the Eaton Collection has. Not only primary, but also rare and valuable and very expensive secondary and critical texts that would be very hard for me to get my hands on and get easy access to. And being able to go back and forth between those kinds of texts and the primary materials has been very valuable. When I was doing some of the kind of historical background research for my dissertation, being able to not only have access to the amazing Weiler volumes, which are very difficult to get your hands on, but being able to look up the description of an old story and say, oh, that might be useful, and then put in a call notice for that and have it appear and compare Weiler's description of it to the actual story and look at the advertising and letters around it. Having the total package of the history of science fiction at my fingertips at once was an invaluable resource that I'm very grateful to.
All right, so since the students were quite modest, I'm going to brag a little bit about them and the projects they're actually doing. And in part because this is research that's really been made possible by the fact that we have this resource on our campus. If it was not a resource that they could access on a sort of daily, weekly basis, it's very expensive to get funding to do archive trips to special collections. And then when you try to cram all your research into the week you can afford to be someplace, it becomes more difficult to sort of let research develop organically and return with follow-up questions. So I'll talk a little bit about each of their projects, and then I'll put another question to the panelists. So Taylor's research ended up being about questions of sort of technology and how a kind of imaginary of race informed how we think about technology. So this is a really exciting and innovative question. It's really representative of one of the new directions that the field is going right now, which is really thinking through science fiction as a sort of social rubric that is codifying ideas we have around technology, who uses technology, who doesn't, what kind of imaginaries of the future and who's included in those futures are implicit in how we tell these stories. As we'll hopefully talk about a little later in the panel, the people writing in the field now has diversified quite a bit. And so Taylor's research, based on this quite sort of cutting edge critical paradigm, he's able to go back to these pulp stories that were imagined to be ephemeral at the time that they were published, aren't really overtly taking up these kinds of questions, but with the sort of theoretical apparatus that he's able to bring in through his research, he was able to illuminate something really important about how these pulp magazines, which many people dismiss and many people have forgotten, nonetheless kind of encoded a default way that still informs how we think about technology today. So that's sort of one of the possibilities that came out of Taylor's research. Brandy's research, since Brandi is earlier in her program, we're still figuring out what Brandy's PhD research will be, which is an exciting time. But the furry research that she was able to do was really, as an undergrad, A, that was a really great opportunity for an undergraduate to have, and B, she was able to write her first published book review of her career on a book written by somebody whose archive of other materials she was able to consult while preparing this book review. So I think that was a really unique and interesting opportunity. And I know, again, sort of cutting edge questions in the field about sort of environmentalism, questions of humans' relationship with other species, thinking in ecosystem perspectives. These are things that Brandi continues to think about in her research, and so in due time, I'm sure we'll be figuring out a research project around that. And then Josh's research is around something that 10 years ago nobody was really talking about, and now everybody is talking about, which is financial crisis, financialization, the speculative logics of derivatives. And again, we see how important science fiction can be as a sort of discourse or rubric for thinking through questions of like futurity, what it means to sort of colonize the future through derivative instruments, how in things like Batman comic books of the 1980s, we see a certain kinds of ideas about management styles and neoliberal values sort of taking shape of the comic books. And again, that's something he's able to trace out because we have this wonderful comic book collection here. So in ways, even though some of the material is very historical, Taylor especially working on the pulps, which is among the earliest things, and Brandi with the fandom working on questions of early fan culture with our really unique collection of the fanzines, they're still bringing like very cutting edge research questions to this old material, and I think that's something that we hope that will characterize the academic program that we build here. So the next question I'm going to put to you guys then is, what do you think is exciting that's going on in the field of like speculative fiction studies right now, or what should be going on in the field? So just to sort of talk about what the field, your senses of it, and its futures.
Well, mine I feel is pretty easy. I think it's very exciting that the field has diversified in such a big way recently, especially with N.K. Jemison's three-peat at the Hugos for novels recently. That her first novel is being taught in the writing program here across the board pretty much, and we're starting to develop materials for that. So that's a way that I think the field is beginning to acknowledge a diversity of perspectives, which is starting to shape also how we kind of go back and look at some of the older stuff. And what I want to do, I mean, I am already doing this, and I hope other people will continue to do, is to reevaluate some of these older stories that have already kind of become canonical in science fiction, but they haven't been evaluated in terms of their sort of their racial politics, the way that they construct the human in a very kind of narrow way.
So for me, as a newer developing scholar, it's a little bit tricky to answer. However, in the work that I'm doing, in as far as environmentalism and animal depictions and how humans kind of match up with that, I think there was a turn at a point where, of course, we're still in that Anthropocene horror of what we're doing to this planet, but then there are other fictions coming out where we're actually looking at, well, what happens if we make a change, and how is the planet ultimately affected by us? And so these questions I'm currently working through, and like, how do we bring animals and environments into that space to start thinking about changing what we're doing? And work that I'm doing right now is looking at how Los Angeles needs to restructure its idea of civility and development with the environment in ways where mountain lions aren't poisoned, fires aren't seen as devastating events, but instead part of an ecosystem, but also consider the fact that these are based out of a hatred of the other that we can see definitely in the crisis with the homeless population in LA. And how is it that we're using the ecosystem to really ignore an issue that we're still dealing with within this culture and society? And so with those in mind, I think the field has a lot of opportunity to grow, and I always compare what we're doing right now with, I think it was 2KO or something, around 2000, where we thought computers were going to destroy the world.
Y2K.
Yeah, Y2K.
How old we all are. I don't know what that is.
I was a baby at that point. But thinking about, okay, if Y2K was based off these speculative imaginings, what about now, and how can we use that as a way to change what we're doing to the planet, but also the people who live on this planet?
Having gone from the beautiful period of studenthood into being primarily a teacher of science fiction, encountering the ways that my students are encountering science fiction now, one of the things that's really struck me is that the practices and modes of engagement that were fostered in science fiction, the forms of fandom, the forms of community developed in the kinds of fanzines that are enshrined upstairs in the Eaton, have come to permeate not only American culture in general, but particularly American youth culture. And as those forms of interaction become some of the most important sites of interpersonal relationships, political engagement, educational practices, actually going back to some of those moments in the fanzines, in the letter columns, where those forms of interaction really gestated and took form, is, I think, really important to understanding some of the most important things that are happening now. Some of the most important ways that my students are making meaning in the world with science fictional images have their origin in some of the things that are collected upstairs. And returning to those and thinking hard about them is a way of thinking hard about some of the most crucial questions that we're thinking about as educators right now.
Okay, so last question for me, as a kind of prelude to the fact that I know there's going to be an opportunity to tour the collection and go on the stacks lately, which is very exciting. People don't always get to do that. I wanted everyone to sort of, I'll give you some time to think as I do mine, but what is your sort of aura event or moment where you like knew something was in the collection or saw something in the collection and you're like, wow, like this is the actual thing that's there before me now. So we have many exciting things. A few years ago when it was the 50th anniversary of Star Trek, and I was working with JJ, the Klein librarian at the time. It's the JJ Klein librarian, her name is JJ, so it's very hard for me to say that sentence. So I was working with JJ and we were like pulling things out to put on display for this French television company that came to do a documentary on Star Trek, and I discovered, like, as well as we have so many books and manuscripts and the things that one maybe thinks of an archive having, we also have like a surprising to me number of material items as well. We have material culture of fandom, an enormous amount of things invented around Star Trek that I never would have even known we had. And so two things, one that came out of that discovery and one which is slightly different, that are my moments when I first was able to go on the stacks and be like, wow, we have these actual things. So one that came out of the Star Trek is, as anyone who's a Star Trek fan knows, there's this very famous lore in fandom about how the series was going to be canceled, and then B.J. Trimble organized a letter writing campaign, and they wrote these letters, and they ensured that the series went on for another season, and thus ensured a 50-plus year franchise now, which seems to show no signs of stopping. And we have the actual template of the letter she used in the collection. So see, that was a kind of moment for me. But the one that touched me more personally is we have both original editions, the 1818 and the 1831 of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And I personally like to believe a woman-founded science fiction, so I'm thrilled that we have both. There was an aura moment for me touching those editions.
Thank you. Yeah, that's probably my most aura moment, was also when they did the 200th anniversary of Frankenstein, yeah. And they had all the books out there, and I picked it up and I was like, wait a second, I'm holding it, it's there, it's in my hand. But the biggest, I think my most aura moment that maybe wasn't planned by somebody else, was looking through the fanzines, and I found Ray Bradbury's very first published stories in a fanzine which is a known fact. It's, you know, on his ISFPP page, that's his first thing. But I didn't know that. I was flipping through looking for something completely different, and suddenly there was Ray Bradbury and this weird faded image around it, and then the story that was actually kind of okay. I think he was 17 when he published it. But it was just this moment where I had never truly appreciated the way that science fiction as a genre was created by its own fans. He was a fan at 17, submitting publications. His first publication was in a fanzine, and then soon after that he became a professional writer. And I've written about him since then. So that was a big moment for me, was to kind of realize that was real.
My answer is actually going to blend in a little bit with that. When I went for a senior seminar we were doing on posthumanism, of course I knew the furry materials were there to some extent, and I knew what exact materials like Fahrenheit 451, Frankenstein, Dracula were here. But I think the part that made me most emotional was there was an entire row of fan fiction and slash fiction. And it was hard for me not to want to cry, because I think sci-fi, more than any other form of literature, affects us and is affected by us. And to see that these stories were there means that there are other stories that could be accepted, and we just have to figure out whose voice isn't heard. And so while a lot of these collections were based on older science fiction writers, I think the turn that we're seeing a lot with that inclusion initiative with science fiction, who's writing whose stories and whose voices are heard, seeing that represented and then knowing where we're going was really a touching moment for me.
It's hard to beat the Frankenstein. I mean, it's, that auratic moment is powerful.
I think I beat it.
I mean, I've had many moments in the stacks just being like, you mean I could touch that? I mean, not just look at it, but like I knew that intellectually that many of the things that are up in the stacks are there, but it's another thing to actually physically see them. A delight that you will soon experience yourselves. Look forward to it. In my own experience, I had just some of the kind of mundane experiences of reading. I came in and I read most comics that Batman appeared in during the 1980s. Upstairs, there are many. But I had read many of them in kind of collected editions before, but being able to see them in the context of each other with the advertisements amongst the comics and with all of the letter columns just creates a kind of view of the cultural moment that is impossible to achieve anywhere else. And it wasn't necessarily like a single kind of auratic jolt, but it was a kind of combined aura that really took me back and made me appreciate that cultural moment in a way that I never could have in any other context.
Thank you. So now I wanted to see if any of you have questions for any of the panelists.
I'm not afraid.
We're not supposed to be scary. The horror is all in the collection.
I've been interested in the use of science in science fiction for many years. One of the things that I've noticed, I don't know if it's a hallucination or what, but it seems to me that you know, we always talk about science fiction, almost always, as being hundreds of years in the future, thousands of years in the future. But I think more and more now we're getting what I would call near-term science fiction. And I think Weir started this in The Martian, with that book, because the details were so well laid out. And something that should be done in the next decade, perhaps. And there's been more to like that. There's one that just came out, Voyage to Enceladus, where he was going out to study the gas streams from the particular tiny orbital. So I guess what I'm driving at is this a sea change? Are we seeing more hardcore science, but not just hardcore, but near-term things that are going to turn into reality in a matter of perhaps several years? Another one is artificial intelligence in the driverless car. Just read one about that, where the whole idea was, you know, accept the fact that you could have AI driving your car, go one step further and have AI across the entire population of cars, so you can plan trajectories and things like that. You know, this is going to happen. It's unavoidable, and yet in science fiction, it's right there, right at that cutting moment. So I just wonder what you think about that.
I think science fiction, one of the interesting things about going to the early, especially like the Gernsback era magazines, is that there was a running, actually I think it's the early Campbell ones are the ones I'm most familiar with, there was a running letters section that was specifically science-based questions, and they would often be related to the stories that had been told, but also people arguing with each other about the nitty-gritty of a rocket trajectory in 1930-something or whatever, long before they actually existed. And then there was also the fan letters where they were talking about the stories themselves. These two things kind of existed side by side in the really early fandom. And then the science column sort of went away. And so I feel like science fiction became more about the experience of living in a world that was affected by science more than it was about science itself. And I think that's kind of been the way science fiction is since the beginning, but it kind of imagines itself differently depending on the era. I teach Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451 pretty often, and that's a story that's set in the future, but it's clearly set in 1954. Like it's about the Cold War, it's about youth culture, it's about all these different things, about television. And so he defamiliarizes it by putting it in the future, but I think maybe someone in the room will be able to tell me who said this. There was somebody who said it's not the science fiction author's job to predict the car, but to predict traffic. So it's not the technology, but the effects of technology. I forget who said that, but that's what your question made me think of. Heinlein, it sounds like a Heinlein thing.
It does sound like a Heinlein thing, yeah.
So for me, as a developing scholar in this field, I think science fiction has a lot of power in talking about things that technology is currently doing. Like we have the series Black Mirror, on which I'm writing about, and how technology within our culture is affecting us and possibly going to damage us in the future. And I think in the new wave, correct me if I'm wrong, there's that turn of where we start looking at things of what's happening now through the use of the future and the possibilities of how we're changing. But as far as digital AI and such, I think we still have room to talk about that with these cars and how these ideas of subjecting the robots are based on subjection of other persons' bodies, and just they rely on this history that we have to talk about. And I argue science fiction is a way to talk about that while also staying very much in that present time.
My intuition about some of the preference for nearer and nearer term science fictional moments and science fictional situations that feature kind of new technologies, but in a context that seems relatively familiar to us, is that it might be tied up in the relative lack of kind of big infrastructural planning projects in the last 30 or so years. We think about how having a robot car might change what it's like to ride in a car, but that car is still navigating the highway system that we built in the 1940s and the 1950s. It's still navigating a model of suburban sprawl development that we've been living with, kind of developing technology to allow us to operate more or less intensely in the ruins of mid-20th century development is something that science fiction is thinking hard about. But I think there are still a lot of science fiction writers who are thinking about technology as something that can make big changes, not only in human society, but in the relationship of developed space. But I think that that's less of a generic concern than it was earlier in the 20th century.
So I'm afraid we can only have one question since we're at our time. But before I wrap up, I wanted to thank Steve and thank the library staff for organizing this event and for the support and collaboration over the years that I've been here. I wanted to thank Millie Pena, my dean, for the support of the program. That she's been excellent in supporting our initiatives, helping us host conferences. And I especially want to thank my colleagues, Professor Nello Hopkinson and Professor John Jennings, both of whom are like stars in the field. Nello is one of the most important novelists working in the field right now. John is doing amazing work with a new book series that's emphasizing work by people of color and some wonderful graphic novel adaptations of science fiction texts. So it's great to have you as colleagues and be part of this like cutting edge program here. So thank you, everyone.
So I'd ask you all to join me in thanking our incomparable panel. I'm really glad to share.